Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about Drudgery Divine by Jonathan Z. Smith. I have to show a picture of it on screen because I don't have a physical copy of it. I read it as an ebook on my e-reader. I'm not sure who this video is going to appeal to, but Smith's Drudgery Divine is a pretty important contribution to the field of comparative religion. And hailing primarily out of the University of Chicago, Smith had a long, illustrious career contributing to the academic study of religion. I believe he died in 2017, and upon his death, a whole wave of appreciative articles and books were put together, inspired by his life and his career. I can't speak to all the specifics, obviously, but it definitely seems like he left a substantial legacy, especially for people who knew him and worked alongside him. Drudgery Divine is the first book of his that I've read. It won't be the last. For various reasons that I'll get into, I thought the book was fascinating. And he has a collection of essays called The Map is Not Territory. He also has another book called Imagining Religion, both of which I would be interested in reading at some point. But Drudgery Divine caught my eye and is the first one of his books that I decided to read because it came up years ago when I was doing my own, comparative study of religion thing, and I was reading or struggling to get through, I should say, James George Frazer's The Golden Bough. Look, not to get too much into it, but as far as comparative religion goes, there's few people who have as much of a prominence, at least in the early years of comparative religion, as James George Frazer's, and as that abridged, specifically, edition of The Golden Bough. Because The Golden Bough is like 12 volumes long or something like that, and most people just read it in an abridgment, and that's the one that I was sort of beating my head against when I was initially grappling with it. In really trying to ameliorate some of the suffering that I was going through while I was reading it, I was looking into various things that I could find about it online. That eventually led me to Smith, not only because Smith was a very prominent voice in the world and then the study of comparative religion, but also because Drudgery Divine is an extremely important contribution in a more contemporary world to that field. Initially as well, Smith had written his doctoral dissertation on Frazer's The Golden Bough. I don't claim to know the specifics of it, but while Smith was reading what I'm assuming is the entirety of The Golden Bough and writing a dissertation on it, and then going on to have an illustrious career in the study of religion, I, not to toot my own horn, made this meme. So who's the real smarty pants here? You know what's funny though? I am actually proud of myself for that meme, because it turns out that as I was reading Smith, all of the reasons that I found Frazer to be dull were being borne out as actual criticisms, much more legitimate criticisms that Smith was leveling at not just Frazer, but the methods of Frazer and his many disciples. And while at the time I wasn't like nearly up on all of the things that Smith is up on in order to mount his critique, I was feeling the effects of what was clearly, in my mind, an anachronism at the heart, I should say, of Frazer's method. Because primarily there are two real concerns that I have with The Golden Bough. The first is that Frazer is doing a little bit of, I don't want to call it dishonesty, but he's dancing around something. There's a big elephant in the room on basically every page of his book. And that is, of course, the figure of Jesus Christ and the entire edifice of Christianity. Because the figure of Jesus is not directly referenced in The Golden Bough often, really at all. But Jesus as a religious figure in Christianity is implicit on basically every single page of the book. Which is why I loved it when Smith quotes directly and at some length a contemporary review of one of the volumes of The Golden Bough. The section of the review that Smith quotes goes, "However wide we wander, however deep we delve into the records of the past, we are always coming up against one being, the vegetable god, who is not strange at all once our astonished gaze has recognized the likeness as Jesus. Christianity is seldom mentioned. There is no need that it should be, for Sir James naturally assumes that the main articles of the Christian faith are known to his readers. With Attis, Adonis, or Tammuz, we begin to close about the Christian altar. Behind them, as behind the slave who was the king of the wood, there looms, scarcely named, the shadow of that other God who, as the Son of Man, died on the tree. And inescapably, we are brought to conclude that Jesus the Christ acquired divinity by assuming the attributes of another deity. Christ's birth, death, and resurrection conform to the pattern of the vegetable god. This is a dramatic but perfect reading of what Frazer is trying to accomplish with the Golden Bough, but there's one real problem at the heart of it, which is that the comparisons that he's launching into don't really hold much water when you scrutinize them. See, if you look at the practice of worshiping the figures of, let's say, Adonis or Attis, both of them are associated with the changing of the seasons. And at a specific point on the calendar, these figures die. This is accompanied by the change of season to winter. But later in the year, as with the festival of, say, Hilaria, which commemorates Attis, rather than mourning this figure, there is a celebration in the name of this figure. This corresponds with the coming of spring and vegetation and blossoming and whatnot. Frazer interprets this celebration, festivals like Hilaria, as celebrating the resurrection of their respective mythic figure. But nowhere in that celebration is resurrection ever explicitly celebrated like it is in Christian practices. At this point he writes, "It is now held that the majority of the gods so denoted appear to have died but not returned. There is death but no rebirth or resurrection. The gardens of Adonis, to which Frazer devoted so much attention, were proverbial illustrations of the brief and transitory nature of life and contain no hint of rebirth. The point is that the young vegetative shoots rapidly wither and die, not that the seeds have been reborn when they sprout." So while Smith does acknowledge the importance of Frazer and the presence that Frazer has in the field of, comparative religion and just the study of religion in general, he does make the point that much of the comparisons that Frazer draws between Christianity and other late antique religions doesn't hold up under the scrutiny of a contemporary investigation into the subject. While these negative conclusions have not been without challenge by scholars of late antiquity, from the standpoint of the history of ideas, their importance cannot be underestimated. They represent a genuine reversal in scholarly thought. That which was posited as most primitive, a myth and ritual pattern of dying and rising deities, ultimately based on human sacrifice or ritual murder in relation to the fertility of vegetation, has turned out to be an exceedingly 3rd or 4th century development in the myths and rituals of these deities. But this reversal in scholarly thought that Smith alludes to here, as well as the initial misinterpretation of these myths in late antique religions, do beg the question, where did these misinterpretations come from and why did they have such a staying power within the field? Well, that's where the thesis of the Drudgery Divine comes in, which I wasn't expecting, but which got me very excited when I read it. The pursuit of the origins of the question of Christian origins takes us back precisely to the same point: Protestant anti-Catholic apologetics. It will be my contention in the subsequent chapters that this is by no means a mere antiquarian concern. The same presumptions, the same rhetorical tactics, indeed, in the main, the very same data exhibited in these early efforts underlie much of our present-day research. So it's the Reformation, baby. I love the Reformation, and here we have the Reformation being brought up again, but this time in a very different context. And in a context that's really exciting, because part of the reason that I love studying the Reformation so much, or reading about the Reformation at least, is because of its enduring consequences. It's not like the Reformation didn't have an impact on the world, and here's another instance of the Reformation, and in this case the rhetoric of the Reformation, having an impact all the way into the 20th century in the field of the study of religion. It's kind of difficult to summarize exactly how Smith makes that argument, but I'll refer you to this one passage that gets at least a little bit what Frazer is going for with that thesis. One cannot adopt as a historical model that which was initially developed as an ahistorical myth, the notion of a pristine church during the first 5 centuries, followed by a period of 10 centuries consisting of an initial stage of mixture, then total idolatry. And here he quotes in Latin a favorite Reformation figure of mine, Philip Melanchthon, as Melanchthon talks about returning ad fontes, or in other words, back to the origins of Christianity, and argue simply that the later Roman Church syncretized as a result of its expansion or its entanglement with the pagan empire, while the early church remained miraculously both insulated and free, or some other version of the regnant Protestant mythos. The point is that the Reformation, in the language of Reformation figures, was to return ad fontes, back to the original church. The idea was that through its interfacing with pagan cults and the traditional practices of the Roman Empire into which Christianity was first born, Christianity adopted a lot of those practices and customs and folded those practices and customs into its active practice. The German Reformation was an appeal to history. The discovery had been made that the church, as it existed, was an institution which no longer corresponded to its original, that it was a corrupted, degraded, perverted institution. The appeal to Scripture was not itself the moving spring of the Reformation. It was the consequence of the sense of decay and degeneracy. The Reformation appealed to the Bible because in this earliest record of the church, it had a measure of the deviation from type which had been brought about. So as a polemic, this sort of created the framework for talking about the earliest centuries of Christianity, even in contexts that were very different from the initial discussions of that subject in the Reformation. That, of course, has an effect when you're talking about the first couple of centuries of Christianity and making a comparison between those first couple centuries of Christianity with the other religions that were being practiced in late antiquity. The issue is obviously multifaceted and there's a lot of subtlety to it, but I will quote this one moment where Smith kind of directly addresses one of the major problems with this misunderstanding. The work of comparison within and without the area of late antiquity requires acceptance of the notion that regardless of whether we are studying myths from literate or non-literate cultures, we are dealing with historical processes of reinterpretation with tradition, that for a given group at a given time to choose this or that mode of interpreting their tradition is to opt for a particular way of relating themselves to their historical past and social present. This is most especially the case in the study of the religions of late antiquity. In almost no case when we are treating this period do we study a new religion. The point is that when Frazer was looking back at late antiquity and Protestant apologists were looking back at late antiquity, they looked back at it as if it was a static thing, when the reality is, of course, any particular religious practice changes over time. So when Frazer or Protestant apologists looked back at the religions of late antiquity, they essentially flattened them and treated them as if at a particular moment in time, that's how they always existed. When the reality is each successive generation of people, whether you're talking about late antiquity or even into the contemporary world, each successive generation inherits a tradition, and then that tradition means something different and is expressed in slightly different ways given the situation that the current generation finds itself in. Almost every religious tradition that forms the object of our research has had a centuries-old history. We study archaic Mediterranean religions in their late antique phases. To be able to trace the Eleusinian mysteries from their origin as a 14th century BC family cult to the Gnosticization of their central myth in the Nicene Sermon in the 3rd century AD is to do justice to our data, to the traditions we seek to understand, in contradistinction to the usual static comparison of isolated items such as the putative rising of this or that deity with the resurrection of Jesus. All of this makes for really fascinating reading, although of course it is specific to a specific type of interest that you may or may not share. I will say, though, that the first chapter of the book feels like a masterpiece, a whole thing unto itself, because the first chapter does what the rest of the book doesn't do at all, which is tell a story. He says he wants to talk about the origins of his field, the study of religion, through a correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The two of them had a pretty extensive correspondence late in their lives, and they talked extensively in their letters about religion. Now, obviously, the founding fathers being referenced here are not referenced anywhere else in the book. They're not relevant to the conversation. But to great effect, their correspondence is utilized in the first chapter to tell a story about how the field that Smith is participating in came about. Now, while I loved it, of course, it's relegated to the first chapter, and I will say that the second and third chapters are easily the most unreadable chapters of the book. While I appreciate Smith's obviously incredible and extremely wide range of reading, I do have to say that some of the references that he makes are a little bit unnecessary at times. I mean, of course, that's just my judgment, but at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, despite Henry J. Todd's view in his revision of Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1818 that the term unique was a, quote, affected and useless term of modern times, end quote, it has proved to be both resilient and resistant. Well, okay, I guess it's cool to know that in 1818, when Henry J. Todd was revising Samuel Johnson's dictionary, he decided to refer to the term unique as affected and useless. I mean, it's a cool reference, but it just doesn't feel like a necessary thing to bring up. I don't know. I only mentioned that because, look, and you can probably tell from the quotes that I mentioned throughout the book, it's not easy reading. The first chapter lulls you into a false sense of security on that front, because not only is it easy reading, it's a lot of fun. But that's not to say that the rest of the book isn't fun. They're fun for some people who are interested in the subject and who are interested in interesting claims about the subject that they're interested in. And that's exactly what we see here. And it's one of the points that I'd like to hit home as I make more and more of these videos. Because at the end of the day, I'm not going to sit here and critique, in many instances, whether or not I think somebody's right or wrong. Most of the time, it's just a question of whether or not what they're saying is interesting. While that might sound weird, if it has to have some merit to it in order for it to be interesting. You can't just say a bunch of meritless things that are weird and wacky and off the wall and expect them to be interesting, because they won't do anything. Fundamentally, Smith is ushering in a thesis with this book that does something. It has an effect, and it had an effect. Whether you want to quibble over this or that thing, like, obviously that's fine, but generally books like this stick around and do a lot of work in their field because they are useful in some way. They present an argument that has legs, it goes someplace, it accomplishes something that pushes the field forward in some way. There are many, many examples of this in many, many different fields, and obviously I'm sure if you're interested in this stuff, one of them is coming to your mind right now. But the question in the case of Drudgery Divine or any of the other books that, qualify into this category isn't necessarily for me whether or not they're right or wrong. It's whether or not what they say is useful. I mean, if I were to compare the Golden Bough with Drudgery Divine, of course I would find Drudgery Divine to be the more useful of the two. Drudgery Divine has a nuance, even at a fraction of the length, that I think introduces a utility that is very interesting to a modern day reader. We can, of course, give credit to Frazer for the tremendous work he did at the beginning of this field, but I can see why Drudgery Divine has had the influence that it's had. And I can also see why Smith has had the legacy that he has as well. I'm looking forward to reading more of him. I enjoyed reading this, even if some of it was going over my head. And the footnotes, oh, I forgot to mention, the footnotes are insane. It's a book that deserves a reread in the future for me, and I will do that after I've spent more time with Smith's other writings. So yeah, if you watched this video all the way to the end, I probably would recommend it to you, because it seems like you have at least a passing interest in this subject, and if you do, you might get something out of Drudgery Divine. I'll leave it there for today, though, and I'll see you in a future video.